Everybody, and welcome back to Mrs. G Storytime. We are reading a new book, I Needed a Neighbor, by Patricia Sanjan with permission of Christian Focus Publications. The setting for this book is in a famine-stricken African country, in a refugee camp, and the two characters are a teenage girl and her little brother who are looking for their parents. It can be a very difficult subject matter, but it helps us to understand what others are going through in countries that are war-ridden and famine-stricken and going through great difficulty. And as Patricia Sanjan always does, she brings it all back to the gospel and the hope that we have in the Lord Jesus Christ, and just how wonderful that is. And I just pray that your hearts will be touched by this, and we can have a better understanding of what other people in other countries are going through. And right now we should be praying for them, the believers in those countries. So let's start it out on chapter 1. It was 4:30 on an April morning when Emma woke and looked up into the pearl blue sky, flecked with rose, and wondered how to face another day. It was still blessedly cool, another hour and a half or so before the sun, like some blazing monster, would rise to scorch and wither the earth. She need not move yet, although Anne, the team leader, was already paddling purposely towards the corrugated enclosure that housed the shower. But Anne was always half an hour earlier than anyone else, and half an hour too soon, so that need not worry Emma. The occupants of the other 5 beds scattered about on the cracked earth of the compound were fast asleep, and it was quite quiet. April in England, thought Emma. At this time of the morning the dawn chorus would be starting up, but there were no birds in this dry, thirsty land, and no sign of spring. There was something else at the back of her mind, and after a moment or two she remembered. It was her birthday. She had only arrived from England 5 days previously and had not told anyone about her birthday, nor would there be any post for another 10 days when someone would be coming down from the capital. A great wave of homesickness swept over her as she remembered her birthdays past. The laughing girls in the nursing homes gathered around her cake, the vicarage in Devon, and the presents on the breakfast table, foam of blossom in the garden, and soft rain on springy grass, or great stretches of sun-kissed dandelions. She swallowed hard, wiped her eyes, and gazed round the scattered beds, the thatched hut that was far too hot to sleep in, the corrugated iron shelters that concealed the shower and the hole in the ground, and pulled herself together. Everyone said she would get used to the heat in a few days. Others had, and she supposed she would too. In any case, it would be better today because there would be more to do. For today, the first consignment of 20,000 refugees were due to arrive at the new camp. The others were stirring, so she got up and stood in line for the shower. Breakfast was a hasty meal of tea, bread, and bananas, but this would improve when the stores came down from the capital. By 5:30, Anne was rounding up her team like an anxious goatherd and telling them not for the first time that the lorries were due to arrive before sunrise. They packed into the jeep along with 4 or 5 African orderlies, and then they were off, rattling through the sleeping village, over the bridge that spanned the great dam, and over the trackless drought desert with the sunrise behind them. Stunted trees and the carcasses of dead animals were the only options that broke the monotony of the landscape, unless you counted the strange mirage of green growth and pools of water that kept appearing on the horizon and faded as the jeep drew nearer. A clatter and a shout made them all turn their heads in one direction. An open cattle truck with about 40 people clinging frantically to the bars and holding on to each other in the center careened past them. Anne gave an exclamation of indignation, for the driver had no business to be driving at that speed, shaking the very bones of the sick and the starving. The jeep accelerated in hot pursuit, and lines of tents came into sight. The 2 vehicles arrived almost nose to tail, and the team bundled out. Well trained by Anne, they all knew exactly what to do. Some went into the great shelters and waited at their posts by the registration desk, the weighing machines, and the medical and therapeutic centers. Anne and Emma, with a group of orderlies, hurried to the truck. As they lifted the bars at the back, the travelers swarmed forward, and a crowd of little children, hauntingly thin and happy to have arrived, scrambled down and started to shake hands excitingly with everyone in sight. Fathers followed to receive the packages and water pots that their wives handed down to them, and the old and the sick were helped out. Then a woman with frightened eyes handed a little bundle in a goat skin to Emma, climbed out and stood beside her, looking up imploringly into her face. Other trucks were arriving, swerving into line, degorging their packed human cargo. About 1,600 travelers would arrive that morning, but Emma was suddenly only conscious of that pathetic, flickering little life in her arms. She turned to Anne. "It's dying," she said. "Shall I take it straight away?" "Yes, hurry," replied Anne briefly. "Claire's over at the feeding center and she'll have everything laid out. Tell Catherine to come in your place and send someone up to the Red Cross department. They might produce a doctor." Emma hurried, pushing her way through the bewildered new arrivals that were now crowding around the milk cauldrons. She reached the feeding center where Claire was teaching the orderlies in preparation for the expected onslaught of very sick, dehydrated children. But she broke off when she saw the baby in Emma's arms, and together they acted swiftly, passing a nasal tube and starting to inject the life-giving fluid into the tiny, swiveling body. "It's cold," said Emma desperately. "Isn't there something to wrap it in?" "Yes, there's a box over there with some knitted clothes and blankets. Give it to me and take what you like." They dressed it in a striped rainbow-hued vest and wrapped it in a multicolored blanket. Emma carried the incongruous little bundle to the doorway where the sun shone, and a startled blob of color in the midst of those drab surroundings. Brown earth, brown rags, brown bundles. But the mugs of milk were bright orange, and the spears of light that pierced the palm leaf roof sparkled on specks of dust and made tiny pools of brightness on the floor. The place was beginning to fill up now with families of children who had been found to be drastically underweight. Exhausted mothers carrying their babies with huge heads, swollen stomachs, and stick-like limbs slumped on the floor. Hope flickered in the dark, hopeless eyes as the milk and gruel and high-protein biscuits were distributed, and the day grew hotter and hotter. Emma placed her baby in the arms of an orderly and moved from group to group, encouraging them to feed and passing catheters through the nostrils of those too weak to suck or chew. She knew not a word of the language, but she tried to smile at the mute, lifted faces of the parents, and a few smiled back. Some were too tired to cooperate and simply lay down on the rush mats to sleep, leaving their child at last to someone else's care. The only doctor was busy elsewhere. The little families came and went on coming. The nurses and orderlies went on, but Emma's heart stayed with the brightly clad, gasping little creature near the door. "Please, God, let it live," she had cried as she handed it over. But now, moving from one starved, broken child to another, she wondered dully and rebelliously what purpose there could be in such existences. What had they to live for? Nevertheless, she hurried back whenever she could to nurse the baby in the doorway. It was hopeless. As fast as they injected the fluid into the wasted body, just as fast as it flowed away. There were no nappies and water was strictly rationed. Emma took the soaking goatskin outside and lay it in the sun. With the temperature rising to 120 degrees, it would dry in a few minutes. She was holding the baby, gazing down at it, when it opened its mouth, gave a shuddering little breath, and died. Claire came over and they examined it together, but there was no doubt about it at all. They turned to the mother, who sat motionless, half asleep. They made signs, stripped it of its foreign finery, and laid it in her arms. She understood at once and started to wail softly. Then she stopped and seemed to be pleading for something, pointing to her dead child. Claire turned to the orderly. "Ask her what she wants," she said gently. "She wants a white cloth to wrap her baby for burial," explained the orderly. Claire went to search, but there was no white cloth, not so much as a handkerchief or a petticoat. Tissues, jeans, T-shirts were the order of the day. The mother wrapped the baby in a soiled rag and went away to her tent, still wailing softly. "White cloth!" exclaimed Claire. "That's something we must see to before tomorrow." But Emma wasn't listening. She had turned away, seeking a place to weep. Claire squeezed her arm. "I know," she said. "I felt like that at first. You just have to get used to it, and what sort of life it is anyway. Go behind those biscuit cartons and get over it, and then get back to those who are going to recover." Emma crouched behind the cartons, trying to control herself, but was startled by the touch of a hand on her arm. Half angry at being discovered, she wiped away her tears and looked into the face of a girl, so thin and stunted that it was impossible to guess her age. On her back she carried a gargoyle-like child. She was saying something, and it seemed urgent. Emma blew her nose hard and called an orderly. "What does she want?" she asked. She says she wants to help, replied the orderly gravely. To help me? Tell her I thank her. Ask her what her name is. Her name is Merritt. And the child on her back, is that her child? No, it's her brother. They have no parents. No parents? Ask her how old she is. She's 14. She wants to help you. 14. The same age as Becky, her little sister. Becky, the adored youngest of the large family. Becky, who went into ecstasies over her Valentine cards and worried so much about her weight and whether she should diet. Could there be anything in common between Becky and this grave, responsible child with the sunken, suffering, compassionate eyes? Tell her I thank her, and I would be glad if she will help me, said Emma. Tell her she can collect up the mugs now. Merritt looked at her straight in the face and smiled before she moved off. Like sort of a pledge, thought Emma, her tears forgotten. She and Merritt would work together, and she no longer wondered how to get through another day. In spite of the heat and the perspiration trickling down her neck, she was glad she had come, glad to give and heal and comfort. Perhaps she might even help to restore to health that character of a child that flopped on Merritt's back. She suddenly decided that this stifling, crowded shelter was the best place in the world for a young nurse to be. But who was Merritt, and where did she come from? What strange wind of fate had brought them together across thousands of miles? Where was her home? What had happened to her parents? Could Emma ever discover her story? She did not know. She only knew that the touch of Merritt's hand and the steadfast look in her eyes had been the very birthday present she could possibly have received. And tomorrow we'll be reading Chapter 2. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.